Welcome to the talk of Dr. Gareth Dale. We are very happy to have you, Dr. Dale. I will introduce you a little bit. Dr. Dale worked as a senior lecturer in political economy at the Brunel University in Britain. His most recent books are Karl Polanyi, Alive on the Left, and Reconstructing Karl Polanyi, Excavation and Critique, and a Critique of Green Growth. His previous publications include books on Karl Polanyi, The Political Economy on Eastern Europe, Migrant Labor in the European Union, and a trilogy on East Germany, its economic history, protest movements, and 1989 revolution. His work has appeared in many languages, among others in Arabic, Korean, Japanese, German, and English, of course. He will talk today about the topic, the fetishism of technology in environmental debate and policy. We are very happy to listen to your talk. Please, you have your words.
Hey, I hope you can hear me. First off, I should thank Jong Sung Jin for putting on this very impressive lecture series, and I should thank Go Jin Woo for helping with the organization of it. I'm getting some messages in chat, and I'm not able quite to reply at the moment. Very nice to see you too, Richard. I'm glad to see you here. Right, I should warn you. This is going to be quite long, maybe 45 minutes or so. And I'm also going to show a lot of slides. And I think it's probably best if I share my screen. So that's what I'm going to try and do now. Here we go. Right. So this is the topic, and the first slide actually is going to be a digression. Sorry, I need to. Isn't it ironic that in a talk, or maybe not ironic, it's symptomatic that in a talk on technology, I'm struggling with the technology. But here we go. Okay, so the first slide is something of a digression. When I was beginning my research for this paper, I came across a Financial Times essay by Tim Harford, and he was exploring why productivity hasn't been increasing in the service industries. An answer he gives, or an example he gives of it anyway, is computers, these marvelous machines. They're being abused by highly skilled people who use them to noodle around making bad slides. So with the aim of slowing down productivity growth even further, I did a bit of noodling for this talk. But I guess the irony here is that I'm using PowerPoint, which is owned by a tech fetishist tycoon, Bill Gates. Right, so my interest in tech fetishism goes back maybe 15 years or so. I was writing something on another of those tech fetishist tycoons, Richard Branson. Branson, here he is, owns an airline, and in self-justification, he was beginning to present himself as a kind of eco-warrior. Somebody has to fly the planes, he argued, and it's best if someone responsible with ecologically minded runs the airlines and not others. And to burnish this image, he arranged for one of his planes to fly on coconut oil. Here in the photo, you can see Branson slugging its fuel to show us how eco and how healthy flying can be, even its fuel. The problem is, even if flying on pure coconuts is possible, 3 million of them would be needed just for one wee trip from Heathrow Airport to Amsterdam. Planes are heavy. Branson seems not to be so aware of this. An entire world's crop of coconuts would keep Heathrow Airport going only for a couple of weeks. And it's only one of around 20,000 commercial airports out there in the world. So Branson was therefore looking around for technological miracles. And he announced a climate prize would be awarded to whoever invents a new technology that can really mitigate climate change. And the prize was announced to a great deal of fanfare, but then it was never awarded and was quietly forgotten. Now, over on the other part of the slide, more recently, I was passing through another of London's airports. This is Gatwick, and I noticed that it presents itself as carbon neutral, as if planes fly by magic. In this case, we're actually dealing with a mix of greenwash and accounting trickery, but it feeds into a broader zeitgeist that magical technologies are being developed to enable business as usual to carry on while climate change magically is being mitigated. In fact, as I'm sure all of you are aware, no serious mitigation is taking place. I'm showing you here the graph of atmospheric carbon as measured at Mauna Loa. And this graph, more than any other, I think, sums up our plight. Where it plots the upward curve of emissions against the progress or lack of progress of policymakers' attempt to mitigate them. Utterly futile, as you can see. So let's pause on the last of the negotiations in the top graph. It was the Paris Agreement of 2015. And the governments there, they pledged to reduce emissions to keep heating below 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial average. This is still a potentially dangerous level given the risk of positive feedbacks kicking in, leading to cascading tipping points and so on. But at least 1.5 gives us some prospect of stabilizing the climate. Now we're 6 years on from Paris. How have they done? A few weeks ago, the United Nations reported that nothing is being done. If government's current pledges are fulfilled, emissions would reduce by only 1% by the end of this decade compared to 2010 levels, when a 45% reduction is needed if there's a chance of keeping heating on track to 1.5. Now, this is no surprise. And it's no surprise partly because the Paris Agreement was built on tech fetishism. The entire agreement is a gamble on an untried technology called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, this is a very bright idea. You create colossal plantations of trees, you chop them all down, you burn them as fuel, you filter away the carbon dioxide and you stick it underground. Fine in theory, but it runs up against colossal problems when you implement it and when you scale it up. It involves all sorts of carbon emissions itself and potential leakages. You can see it summarized on the slide. It requires immense amounts of water. It requires that the forests don't burn down, and increasingly forests do that. And the size of land required for these forests. BECCS would devour monstrous amounts of land, somewhere like equivalent of all current cropland, possibly quite likely the size of one Australia, or twice the size of India, or 37 times the size of Britain. To grab that land area for plantations would send food prices soaring. All this is now recognized by the scientists involved and by the United Nations. BECCS has been basically dropped. And with it, the entire material substructure of the Paris Agreement. Now, the defeat of the Paris project should have led to a radical rethink, but instead, we can be sure that new technologies are being put forward as the new magic bullet to complement or replace BECCS. We're seeing electric cars and hydrogen, obviously. Some people are speaking of nuclear fusion, although the old joke about fusion is that for the last 6 decades, it's always been just a decade away. We're likely to see geoengineering and direct air capture. All of these technologies have been massively overhyped. Some of them are extremely dangerous, and almost all of them will run into colossal problems of scaling up. Now, just a week or two ago, John Kerry, the United States climate ambassador, came up with this quote, this contention or claim that half of American emissions are going to come from technologies we don't yet have. The technologies that don't exist and perhaps never will. So technological fantasy then is the official policy of the world's ruling class. And the John Kerry version is not much less genocidal than Donald Trump's was, even if it's certainly not so consciously sadistic it's a sort of slower, calmer style of genocide, but this fantasy is absolutely extraordinary. So how do we get a handle on this as Marxists? Well, we need to look at tech utopianism and tech fetishism. And what got me working on this paper was the question, well, you know, is there a theory of tech fetishism in Marx and in Marxism? And that's what I'm going to be looking at in the rest of this paper. And I'll take separate sections on Marx and on 20th century Marxism. But before I get to that, I'm going to have to sketch out some historical background. I want to look at the intersections between technology and the supernatural. I want to look at the way in which machines supply metaphors that organize the way we think of the economy, the way we think of nature, and the way we think of human life itself. So this contextual, this background section, I think is important for understanding Marx and Marxism. But if you're only interested in Marx and Marxism, then you can take 15 minutes, go and have a coffee and come back, and I'll be on to Marx roundabout then. I want to start then this section with looking at the mechanical clock. It's a contraption for measuring and transmitting information. In a sense, it creates information. It's an information technology in a sense. And it was invented in China and then spread through Europe, especially in the monasteries. And then the merchant class took it on, and before long, town clocks had become the markers of bourgeois prestige in Europe and of technological progress. And this link between technology and bourgeois pride replicated on the world scale. In America, in the early years of colonization, some of the English settlers, they were Puritans, many of them, and they were reluctant to feel pride in their technologies. That would be idolatry. It would be you're taking their eyes away from God onto their own products. That's idolatry. But before very long at all, they had overcome these doubts, took pride in their superior tools and weapons, and they constructed an image of the native peoples of America as pre-scientific, technologically deficient. This was part of their self-definition as settlers, that they were more technologically advanced. And around about this time, I'm still in the 17th century, really. This was marked the beginning of the narrative of progress with a capital P. And in this narrative, technology becomes the sign of modernity. Colonizers have it. They're at the vanguard of history. They have the magic technologies, the firearms and so on, which provided justification for their takeover of the world. The slide has actually skipped forward a couple of centuries to show you a very vivid portrayal of this. This is Fanny Palmer's painting from 1868. Across the continent, westward, the course of empire makes its way. And look at how the railroad carves society in two. On the left, you've got settled agriculture, you've got Anglo civilization, the tool makers. On the right, you have nature, and you have nomadic people, and the locomotive is driving history towards the left, towards civilization, and leaving the native peoples. You can see them just there choking in the smoke. But let's go back to the clock now, back to the 17th century for a few minutes. I want to spin back there just for a time, because the 17th century, by the way, was the century in which the word technology, at least in English, came into use. And the clock was the key machine of the manufacturing age. The early factory machines were invented and they were manufactured by horologists. It was the gadget that made capitalist society tick. It was counting out value and enforcing labor discipline. And the marriage between clocks and capitalism was absolutely basic to the scientific revolution in Europe and to giving birth to a new cosmology. In this new imaginary, the clock and the cosmos appeared to mirror one another. Here on the screen, on the slide, you can see Francis Bacon. He's describing a clock, a subtle and precise thing that seems to imitate the celestial bodies and the heartbeat of animals. So the clock is imitating nature. And here below is Bernard de Fontenelle in France, describing nature. Nature is imitating the clock. It's operated by wheels and counterweights. And so on. The universe is so the clock, the machine that is the clock and the universe appeared to these philosophers and early scientists of the 17th century and early 18th to mirror one another. In this period, nature was losing its associations with magic and the supernatural. And instead, people such as Bacon and de Fontenelle were coming to think of nature as a law-governed realm, a realm made of interacting parts that interact in regular ways, just like a machine, just like clockwork. But even though magic was being expelled from the picture, as you're probably aware, the supernatural was returning through the back door for theologians, such as Thomas Burnet. The universe in this book here, the universe was made by God, much as a clockmaker. And it follows, just like a clock, the universe follows regular lawful mechanisms. Here's God at his little desk designing humans and drawing up the laws of the universe. So for Burnet, I should say, even animals are example of nature's clockwork. That's a quote. And many other thinkers of the same period were coming to see human life itself as a kind of divine machine. Now, crucially for the argument I'm making in this paper, which I promise I'm going to get to, God was revealed to be not simply a clockmaker, but also a positivist. In other words, not only did God create the universe as a mechanical realm, but he also created the market economy in just the same way. It's an economy governed by laws that works like a machine. And you can see this in the metaphors that were used by economists, the early economists of the 17th and early 18th centuries. The circulation of money and commodities, they often compared to, well, you guessed it, a clock. This quote is from Gerard de Malins. He's describing the balance of payments and comparing it to a clock, or circulation would be compared to the circulation of money was compared to the circulation of blood. And increasingly, the metaphors from this era of early economics came from mechanics, from astronomy, geometry, hydrology. There was talk of the rivers of trade and the ebb and flow of money. These are some examples here from Misselden and from de Malins. But I could have shared with you Bernard Mandeville on the economy working as clockwork, or I could have talked of Bois-Guilbert, who talked of the economic movements as being just like the changing level of the River Rhône at Geneva. Or I could have mentioned Dudley North, who compared the movements of money to the movements of the tide. He was inspired by Isaac Newton's discovery just a few years earlier that the tides are influenced by the moon, and Newton set this out in his equilibrium theory of tides. Notice the term equilibrium, which became increasingly important in economics. So the point is that as the concept of an economy began to crystallize, it was on the model of natural systems, the market economy as an emanation from nature, ultimately an emanation from God. So the emphasis for these economists was on the market economy as orderly, oriented towards equilibrium. And all of this was carried on into the next metaphor of economics, the great metaphor of liberal economics, which was the invisible hand. The invisible hand is a poetic expression of the idea of general equilibrium, that if you have a system of interconnected markets, rates of return are going to equalize, which benefits all of us, as Adam Smith famously argued. But I want to focus not on Smith's economic use of the metaphor, but on his first use of the metaphor, because this brings us to the question of fetishism. And you find it in his history of astronomy. So not a book about economics, but astronomy and general discussion of all sorts of topics. And in this passage, he's discussing how savages, in his terms, their lives are governed by vulgar superstition, and they explain natural events, they explain nature by reference to invisible beings. I'm quoting there, invisible beings such as gods, demons, witches, and fairies. So ancient heathens, says Smith, would punish the axe that had been used to murder someone. They'd offer sacrifices to rainbows and so on. And he says this kind of superstition, you know, even we civilized people are prone to it. But, you know, we take a second look and realize, you know, we apply our rational minds and we realize that's not the way things work, that nature follows laws. But these savage people, they ascribe agency and power, that's a quote from Smith, to gods. That's the savage and ancient understanding of the natural world. And it's at this point in his argument that Smith uses the metaphor for the first time. He talks of the invisible hand of Jupiter. He's using the phrase now pejoratively as an example of the beliefs of savages and the foolish ancients. But he's describing fetishism. But he would take the metaphor later on in his own way and to use it to apply to the invisible hand of the market attached to the arm of God, which is his own form of fetishism. Right, now I want to move at last, sorry for the wait, but I want to move on to towards Marx and technology fetishism, as I promised to do. And now Marx's century is the 19th century, the century of steam, of rail, and the century of tech fetishism. It was the century in which the word technology, at least in English, gained the full meaning that we have today. And in Britain, we saw a strand of liberal techno-utopians emerging, centered on capitalists such as Andrew Ure, who really fell in love with their machines. For we capitalists, we own our machines and we use our machines to discipline our workers. And so the dominant stream of tech utopianism that arose in the 19th century was liberal, but some socialists joined it as well. Probably the most notable was Henri de Saint-Simon, the French businessman and socialist theorist. He was a remarkable figure in many ways. One is that he was very thoroughly bourgeois, yet for inexplicable reasons is seen as a socialist. He led a very eventful life. His attempted suicide, I was reading the other day, he shot himself in the head 6 times, but still didn't succeed. So in many ways, a remarkable guy. And I think for me, the exemplar of tech fetishism on the left among socialists. But the same century, the 19th century, also saw the crystallization of the main streams of reaction against tech fetishism. We encounter various kinds of technophobia and techno-pessimism and techno-skepticism. One of them was Luddism, so working class machine breaking. Another was aristocratic anti-industrialism, which was basically, by this I basically understand the movement of the landowners who are appalled by these bourgeois upstarts with their ugly factories and machines and making more money than us. How outrageous. And this has been a strand of technophobia that runs up to and into the 20th century as well. If you think of the blood and soil philosophy of Martin Heidegger, for example, I think that stems from that tradition. Maybe Arnold Galen as well. But there was also a techno-skepticism of a bourgeois radical kind. And here we are at the romantic critique of industrial civilization. People who are criticizing the way industrial society regiments us and quantifies human life. And once again, this strand, which really came into being in the 19th century, it flows through to the 20th, Leo Tolstoy and Lewis Mumford and numerous others. But what about Marx? Marx was not a Luddite. where does he fit in? He wasn't a Luddite, even though he sympathized very strongly with them. Was he a romantic? I don't think he was a romantic, at least not in any simple sense. He was famously a Promethean. You know, he celebrated humans as a tool-using people, a species that's constantly transforming the world and itself in part through technologies. And when he was young, you could even hear him praising the role of technology in driving forward the bourgeois revolution. You know, as you can see in this quote on the slide. And so Marx valued technology. He saw it as a vital element enabling the kind of abundance that would be necessary to creating a communist society. But all of this doesn't make him a techno-utopian or even really, I think, a technophile. I mean, you've got to remember that when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, it's clear that they already thought the forces of production were beginning to reach the stage where a transition to communism was becoming viable, at least in some parts of the world. This was back in 1848. It was before the invention of the car, before the telephone, before even the invention of the safety pin. And when Marx writes about technology in Das Kapital, you have to look at the metaphors he uses, the words he's using to describe machines. Look at the words he uses. They allow no room for ambiguity. Demon, monster, cyclops, autocrat, torturer. So the point, of course, for Marx is that capitalism betrays the potential of technology. Capitalism turns technology to demonic ends, to crushing workers and despoiling nature. These are some of the better known quotes from Marx that capture this argument he's making. And so when he writes of the capitalist system, then Marx very occasionally does use metaphors from the natural world, from the physical world, because, you know, he's trying to explain the way the market system works, and he does obviously see capital circulation as law governed in some ways. But he runs this language alongside a much bigger welter of images and visual languages, especially from the Gothic, in order to try to capture the mystification of the system, its violence, its nightmarish irrationalities. And so this is why I began this paper by looking at metaphors in pre-Marxist political economy, because it enables us to see what an astonishingly different rhetorical strategy Marx is using in his critique of political economy. And this is also where fetishism comes in, because fetishism is another of these languages alongside the Gothic that Marx is using to portray this very strange system in which economic domination is taking a mystified form. And the concept of fetishism Marx plucked from a racist bourgeois discourse. It was a term used by European colonials when they were in Africa, especially disparaging the foolish, superstitious natives there. These people, these African people, didn't play by our commercial rules, which of course were ordained by God, the highest. Instead, they invested their weird, they invested supernatural powers, I should say, weirdly in these fetish objects. But the French writer who popularized the term fetishism, he was especially shocked in Africa to see that in some places they even appear to lack a taste for commerce. So you see with Marx, the tables are very dramatically turned with his theory of fetishism. In his theory, it's the European commercial economy that is itself profoundly fetishistic. And Marx deserves more credit than he has received for this, because he was deploying a critical anthropological gaze reversal around a century before it became popular through anthropologists such as Horace Minor and others. But Marx is being even more bitingly satirical than they are, because he turned the charge of fetish worship back onto the European ruling class. He's saying it's they who bow down before objects. I think David McNally has put this very well in his book, Monsters of the Market. Rather than the rationalists they proclaim themselves to be, Europe's rulers are the ones practicing idolatry. But it's more than a simple devotion to things. Commodity fetishism is a devotion to an abstraction. Liberalism then introduces a preposterous kind of idolatry. It's not the reverence for sensible things, it's the worship of an abstraction. Right, I'm not going to go any further into Marx's theory of commodity fetishism. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with it broadly. This is the central passage from Marx's discussion of this, the basic formula of commodity fetishism. When social labor takes the form of commodities, the relations among humans appear as relations between things. And this serves the ruling order in mystifying the forms of power at work in capitalist society. This is a fetishistic system in that the dead, in this case, dead labor, through commodities, the dead dominate the living and the dead come alive in a sense. Money, Marx goes on to say, seems to grow through its own magic powers. He talks of the capital fetish, value creating value, money fetishism. Money seems to create value and yield interest and grow just in the same way that living things seemingly grow from their own energies. Like a money tree grows much like a pear tree, so to speak. Right, let's finally move on to technology fetishism. What is it, and does Marx have a take on it? Well, he doesn't explicitly give it a label, but it's clear that he thinks technology and capitalism has a fetish character beyond simply partaking of the commodity fetish. At least anyway, he describes machinery invested, when machinery is invested with the power of capital, it appears to autonomously control the production process and the workforce. Read his descriptions of technologies under capitalism. It's often in this sort of passage, where technologies gain control in an animated fashion over the workplace and over human beings as well. And if you read a passage like that, you could, I suppose, say that Marx is simply conveying his horror at the domination of capital over humans. But he's applying exactly the same imagination on the same Gothic canvas as in his commodity fetishism theory. So his idea of technology fetishism is really an extension of commodity fetishism. A slightly different account of Marx on tech fetishism is given by David Harvey. It's a very interesting piece, I think. Harvey centers on the way in which firms that are innovating by introducing new technologies, that's a critical way of gaining ground, of stealing a march on their rivals in the marketplace and making super profits. And I think this is pretty important, and it's definitely very insightful and part of the picture. I wouldn't place it quite front and center in the way that Harvey does, but it's definitely needs to be brought in. All right, I've been arguing that Marx had an implicit thesis on technology fetishism. It's not explicit, it's not well known, but it's there. Unfortunately, he is much better known for his occasional lurches into technology fetishism of his own, or technological determinism, which is a symptom of the same disease. You know, the the nonsense he talks at one point about hand mills and steam mills, that sort of thing. And Marx's followers, or many of them at least, learned from this techno-determinist side of Marx. I'm thinking of people such as Karl Kautsky and Plekhanov and Nikolai Bukharin. They were not crude technological determinists, and they weren't not in the way that I'm presenting Kautsky on this slide. I'm caricaturing his thought a little, but only a little. I mean, sometimes Kautsky was an absolute technological determinist. And this has been a very strong thread within subsequent Marxist theory. Right, I want to move now to the final section of this paper, and that's to look at 20th century Marxism. And in the first half of the 20th century, sorry, the discussion of technology and of fetishism in Marxist theory, it was shaped by 5 main coordinates. One of them was the techno-utopianism associated with the Russian Revolution. Another one was war and the fetishization of military technology. Think about futurism or Ernst Jünger. A third was the rise of consumer society. So commodities were being mass-produced, being advertised with newly seductive forms of advertising. Machines were entering into the zones of social reproduction and leisure. So daily life was becoming more and more technological. So that's the third coordinate that shaped discussion on these questions in the early 20th century. Fourthly, if we're talking about fetishism, we need to talk about Freud. Sigmund Freud coined a new meaning for fetishism, and he took it in a very different direction to Marx. Freud's concept is not anthropological or political economic, it's psychological, and it's ultimately sexual. If any of you in the audience are fetishists, well, if you're male anyway, this is Freud, a very bourgeois. He's a very straight-laced thinker, very bourgeois in some ways, which I find fascinating because he's straight-laced, but kind of exploded the laces, so to speak. Anyway, so he's talking only about boys, but if you're a fetishist and you're a male, you'll know that Freud's explanation for your deviance, as he saw it, is your abnormal reaction to castration anxiety. That moment back when you were a toddler, when you looked up your mother's naked legs and, oh my Lord, she doesn't have a penis. And in primal shock, your unconscious desires were started flailing around and hooked onto whatever else you could subliminally recall from that crime scene, her foot, maybe her shoe, or some other object that you can attach your tongue to instead. So for Freud, fetishism then is a subjective process, a process in which our sense of confusion and lack manifests through an attraction to objects. And with this coinage, a whole new discourse of fetishism got going with its subjective focus on the eroticized desire for things, for objects. So that's the fourth coordinate in the early 20th century. And the fifth is that political parties influenced by Marxism came to power in the late 1910s and 1920s. And here I'm thinking above all of the German SPD, it's the one I know best. And these parties quickly accommodated themselves to capitalist modernity. And one way of doing so is accommodating to technophilia and techno-optimism that is built into bourgeois society. And so when we began to see a philosophical reaction against those party state projects, when it came from the left, it took by and large a romantic flavor and a techno-skeptical form in some ways. I'm thinking of George Lukács, but I'm thinking above all of Walter Benjamin. And I want to say a little about Benjamin or Benjamin if you prefer, because more than any other thinker, he joins the 5 dots, the 5 coordinates on this slide, and it's he who had the deepest insights into techno-fetishism. Now, he was not a technophobe at all. If anything, the opposite. He found books such as this one absolutely thrilling. But the relationship of humans to technology, he argued, had become warped, and technology had taken its revenge in the First World War. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, his thinking on technology evolved in I think, deeply interesting ways. He was keen on reading novels such as this. It's a kind of, it's also a techno-utopian novel, also about building towers, but it has a kind of weird eco-slant to it as well. It's set on an imaginary planet inhabited by fungus-absorbing creatures who lead super high-tech lives, but without really despoiling nature. And around this point in time, Benjamin comes up with a really beautiful statement, I think, on very original statement on nature and technology, on the mastery of nature not being the object, but mastering the relationship between humanity and nature. That's what the goal surely has to be. And the fact that he mentions children, by the way, is not coincidental. Children are more central to Benjamin than to any other Marxist writer of the time. Right, I think Benjamin had a brilliant theory, emergent theory or embryonic theory of technology fetishism. And it's brilliant partly because he had a deep and a very original understanding of commodity fetishism. He took the Marxist concept, he leavened it with Freud, and then he took it on a tour around the arcades of Paris, looking into the shop windows of mass consumption. And he used the concept to take a different new look at fashion, gender, sex work, all sorts of things. So his use of fetishism traveled quite a long way beyond Marx, and it includes those new Freudian associations with subjective desire, with the erotic, and so on. But it's all rooted in a deep understanding of Marx's approach. And Benjamin, more than anyone, I think, saw very clearly that the concept of tech fetishism is there in Marx. In the Arcades project, Benjamin writes this. The first few lines are Benjamin, and then he's quoting from Marx. And this, I think, is a very interesting place in Benjamin's work in the Arcades project. I'm not going to read out the whole quote, but maybe I'll return. I want to move on towards the end of this paper. Maybe I'll return the slide to that quote in case anyone wants to read it again. Benjamin also is important because he diagnosed the fetishism that had entered Marxist theory in the form of technological determinism. In Benjamin's analysis, the SPD had become a prisoner of its own conviction that the historical tide was on its side, pushed ever onward by the locomotive of technological development. I think this was mentioned in an earlier talk in this same series by Marcel Stölzer. So I've stolen one of his slides, which encapsulates Benjamin's critique of social democracy. And so this technophilia, Benjamin argued, was a necessary part of the SPD's accommodation, German social democracy's accommodation with capitalism. And it was part of its rejection of radical strategies geared to rupturing the historical present, to pulling the emergency brake, as he famously put it in this quote, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. All right, finally now, and I'm going to be brief now because I know I've taken long enough. Let's ask, after Walter Benjamin, which Marxists took up this concept of technology fetishism? I guess in this at this point, we have to really mention Marcuse and Adorno and Horkheimer, I suppose. I say I suppose because I don't think they really grasped technology fetishism as a particularly Marxian concept, and I don't think they took it in such interesting directions as Benjamin did. For Marcuse, it wasn't just an afterthought, really. His take on technology was already established in a famous essay in 1941, and fetishism there doesn't get a mention. Instead, you get a very familiar romantic argument that, you know, semi-Weberian, that technological rationality standardizes thought and culture, it smothers individuality. Machines can help humans to travel and communicate. Cars, for example, do this, but they intercept and absorb their libido. So you can see there's a Freudian infusion into Marcuse, but in this a rather different way. So, you know, the fetishism here is the human being falls in love with his technological creature, his automobile, and so on. And Adorno had some interesting comments on technology as well, which I've reproduced also on this screen. Later on, when Marcuse wrote Eros and Civilization, so this is a book where he tries to marry Marx and Freud, even though these are the two originators of the modern critical theoretical conception of fetishism, there's no mention of fetishism in that book. And then when we get to One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse does mention tech fetishism, but only in passing. Otherwise, it's the usual left romantic stuff in that book. And similar applies, I think, to Adorno and Horkheimer. For them, as for Marcuse, the emphasis is always on technology integrating consumers and producers into the dominant system as cogs in the machine, essentially. Right, after Marcuse, and I'll begin to wind up now very soon. After Marcuse and Adorno Horkheimer, technology fetishism receives very little attention in Marxist circles. I mean, Moderator mentions it in passing. I think Harry Braverman does, and a few others. It's only really this century with the anthropologist Alf Hornborg that it receives detailed attention, and Hornborg's work on this is very rich and absolutely fascinating, but he sees technology fetishism and not commodity fetishism as the key to understanding modern capitalism. In other words, as I read him, it's essentially a romantic anti-capitalist position, much more prevalent, I'm afraid, than a Hornborg type position on the Marxist left, is the sort of socialism that models itself on what it sees as the modernity of capitalism. I would call this Saint-Simonian socialism or tech utopianism. Here you can see a typical example from an American socialist website. And what it's arguing is that technology is neutral, capitalism is marvelously inventive and ambitious, and socialists have to embrace that technological advance and that ambition. And we should embrace not just the technology, we should even embrace the dreams of the tycoons who rule the world at the moment. And probably we should embrace that personality cult too. I wouldn't be surprised, albeit maybe with different faces. And then once you embrace all that, you embrace capitalist modernity, you simply nationalize it all, and hey presto, that's socialism. I mean, clearly, I would argue this is a very bourgeois project, and I'm very critical of it. I think Marx would be too. It goes right against the main body, I think, of Marx's work. So anyway, I should come to an end, really. I've been talking long enough. The main points, just to summarize them, that I've been trying to get across or to raise are that in Marx, there is a critique of tech fetishism. It has affinities, strong affinities with romanticism, but it isn't simply romantic. I think it's very useful to us today. as we navigate our way around the very difficult discussions concerning technology and the environmental crisis. You know, obviously some new technologies are very welcome and essential, but equally obviously, at least to most of us in the room here, is that any complacent faith in technological fixes and technological fetishism, these themselves are powerful contributors to the environmental crisis, and they're going to continue to be so, I'm afraid, for a long while to come. And finally, I'll just put up just a few of the books that helped me prepare this this talk. Right, I'll leave it at that. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mr. Day, thank you very much for your great talk. It was very interesting. I expected a talk about Marxist technology, philosophy of technology, but you talk about huge range of the philosophy of technology. It was very interesting, and I'm very grateful for it. I have some questions. I was very amazed among others that you mentioned the aspect of Walter Benjamin. I dealt with Walter Benjamin a lot because since many years, and it's not very common that Benjamin developed the philosophy of technology. It could be very actual in our society. And I was very pleased that you mentioned this topic, and especially this topic that technology is not about mastering the nature, but about mastering the relationship between humanity and nature. And I'd like to ask you if you could explain this point a bit more from your view. It will be my first question. And the second question is, Marx has a very optimistic view about the technology. For him, the technology in itself is not bad. Only the capitalism could misuse the potential of the technology. The technology in itself could be neutral, it could be good, it could be used in a wrong or a right way, in a positive or negative way. And here I have the question, is it possible that to think that there is something like the technology in itself? If Marx thinks technology could be neutral, there could be something like the technology in itself. I'm questioning this point because the technology is from the beginning intertwined with knowledge, science, power, capital. In the development of technology, we can see that the accumulation of the capital causes the accumulation of knowledge. The accumulation of knowledge causes the innovation of technology. They belong all together. Therefore, I would ask you if you think like Marx, if it is possible to think the technology independent from all these other factors.
Should I wait for more questions or come back on those?
Yes. And maybe one more question. What do you think that Marxism could contribute to the actual recent development of the technology like artificial intelligence and digitization? Of course, Marx didn't know this development. He was a person from the 19th century, but is there any way to think about the possible way of developing Marxist philosophy of technology in our context?
Shall I answer now or wait for further questions?
It was a question, yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Benjamin on the mastery of nature. I mean, this is a topic that has come up again and again in Marxist theories of nature. What struck me reading Benjamin was that I hadn't realized that Benjamin had got there at such an early stage with such a wonderful passage in which he formulates this ideal. I mean, he was, as you know, Kim Hyun Kang, he was writing against the dominant modernist framework of the Social Democratic Party of his day, and he's ascribing to them the belief that the job of a socialist state or a social democratic run state is to dominate nature, master nature. We find this, by the way, also in some of the Russian thinkers of the time. I mean, Trotsky and techno-utopianism could require a whole meeting to itself. And I think Benjamin's formulation, therefore, is in that time when the times were moving increasingly towards sort of techno-utopianism, then I think it's very important point he's making. Can there be a technology in itself? No, I don't think in Marx there's the idea that the technology exists in itself. I mean, part of the Bowdlerization of Marxist theory involved the reading of the concept of productive forces as simply technologies and tools, and this became the dominant reading, particularly in Stalinist traditions of Marxism, whereby the way to socialism, the way to the path to a communist society is through innovating and upgrading the technological apparatus. This is their reading for the way in which the productive forces advance, but that concept isn't there in Marx at all. So yeah, I'm sorry you can hear beeping in the background here. I'm supposed to be at a work meeting right now, and I can't detach myself from the notifications. I'm sure there's an easy way of doing that, but I hope they don't get in the way too much.
And what do you think about the second question of the third question of mine? What could be the contribution of Marxist philosophy to the development of today, to technological development of today, like artificial intelligence, digitization, etc., etc.?
Oh, wow. Now you're asking me questions
Yes.
on topics I don't really know enough about. What drives my concern in this question of technological fetishism is the climate crisis. As I explained at the beginning of the talk, we are at this juncture where very drastic action needs to be taken, and obviously new technologies are part of that, and research in new technologies is very important. There's an interesting piece by Andreas Malm and Vin Carton, for example, that I would encourage people to read on direct air capture technology. They argue that the climate crisis is getting so extremely severe that enormous sums of money should be invested in direct air capture technology. And I find myself conflicted on this. And the reason for my conflict is that, you know, the more you press that button, the more you contribute to the techno-fetishism that is the dominant ideology in respect of meeting the challenge of climate change. Which is to say, you know, the John Kerry position, where we're going to solve this problem through technologies that we don't know even exist. That's the dominant, I think, response to climate change. And my worry about pushing technologies such as direct capture is that if you act as boosters for that, you risk boosting the technological fetishism, which is diverting attention from the very radical social change that could and need to take place to really deal with climate change, which generally rely on old technologies. The climate crisis could have been solved long ago with very, very basic technologies, weatherizing houses, some more advanced technologies like solar panels, but a lot of pretty simple stuff like weatherizing houses, moving from private cars to public transport, to bicycles wherever possible and for those who are able, and from beef to non-beef cuisine. These sorts of shifts rely on mostly old technologies and could be implemented very swiftly. There's no technological problem in making those shifts, but no one is doing so. No government is really pushing for those shifts, at least not in any nearly radical enough fashion. And so my worry about pushing the new technology buttons is that it can contribute to the dominant ethos or the dominant politics of climate change, which involves ignoring those effective but socially radical changes that are needed in favor of the magical thinking of techno-fetishism. But on the other hand, you know, we do face an extremely severe climate crisis, and maybe direct air capture, which can work, and I don't know if it can work on the scale required, but certainly I'd be interested to see. I mean, certainly speaking, if we were in a non-capitalist context, certainly I think we'd be arguing to invest heavily in these sorts of technologies. So I think I don't know if that answers your question, Kim Hyun Kang, but yeah, that is sort of some of the origins for the you know, this is what got me going on this particular paper that I've written for your series.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question?
In the chat room, we received 4 questions. So, Hyun, could you read the chat room? First thing is,
yes, but I'm not sure if I put the right one. Okay. Songjin, thank you very much. I learned very much from your attempt to theorize the techno-fetishism from Marxian standpoint and criticizing the eco-modernism popular for the current environment policymakers. Your talk is very helpful for our SSK research and post-capitalism. Just 2 questions for clarification. First, you quoted David Harvey as a critic of techno-fetishism. However, a few weeks ago in this talk program, Patrick Bond included David Harvey in the camp of eco-modernist approach to the climate crisis. What is your opinion? Second, I am wondering whether early Marx, often described as Promethean communism, could be regarded to have something close to techno-fetishism, unlike late Marx. There were two
Okay,
questions.
shall I answer that? Shall I answer those now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. On the first one, David Harvey is a really interesting thinker, I think, in this regard. First of all, I would say that Patrick Bond knows David Harvey better than I do. I think, was Patrick a student of Harvey? I'm not sure, but I think he may have been. So if he says David Harvey is an eco-modernist, then he's more likely to be, it's more likely to be an accurate description than mine. But I mean, I do see certain strands of eco-modernism in Harvey, but there are also romantic strands as well. I mean, Harvey recently came quite close to a degrowth position, which broadly speaking is in the camp of romantic critique of eco-modernism. It's centered on a kind of socialist, utopian socialist / anarchist position. So I don't know, we can ask Patrick what he meant by that, I guess. The early Marx, I mean, the early Marx is really interesting to look at through this lens, because the early Marx was in some ways the most romantic Marx, you know, the passionate, youthful, romantic in spirit Marx, but also the most techno-utopian Marx as well. So yes, if Marx was prone to a kind of techno-fetishism, it was mainly in his early period. I mean, the quote that I gave you from, you know, on ripping up the Bavarian peasant economy and replacing it with combine harvesters was from his early period. I would recommend on this question, Kohei Saito's book. I forget the name of it, but someone can write it into the chat box maybe. He's quite interesting on the evolution of Marx's thinking, and Marx and Engels, their thinking on nature, and he tracks this shift in that direction.
Okay, there are some more comments. Paul Zaremka, I have made the argument that Marxist political economy should critique the concept accumulation of capital. The classical, neoclassical political economy has penetrated Marx's political economy to mean means of production. Marx himself mostly did not mean this, but it is commonly used without any distance from means of production. So I think your work connects with the work I have been doing.
Okay, to that I would say, well, thank you for that contribution. I haven't read your piece on this, but I will do so. I look forward to reading that. I mean, Marx on capital is just fascinating and hard to, capital as a Marxist concept can't just be pinned down to this or that, because it's, you know, it's like light in its waves and particles, so to speak, at the same time. It's a relationship, but it's a relationship that manifests in particular objects and whole arrays of social processes. So what we mean by the accumulation of capital becomes quite complex to pin down as a result. I know this came up. I think you raised a similar question in Owen Miller's talk in this same Yongsan, in the same GNU series a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, so I'll certainly get hold of that piece and read it.
Okay. Is there any more question?
Well, there's Richard's question. Richard Lane
Yes. Where is
on
it?
Luddism, which I'm afraid is a difficult question for me to answer. So shall I read it out? Gareth mentioned Luddism with respect to Marx. Can he expand on the relationship between Luddism and Marx? And what about Gavin Miller's book, Breaking Things at Work? All right. The short answer is no, I can't, because I haven't read Gavin Miller's book. And I haven't been really researching Marx as much as I should have been. I can say, you know, you do read in Marx. I mean, Marx is obviously sympathetic to the Luddites when he discusses them, but he doesn't identify with them, does he? He sympathizes with the class. It's a class, machine breaking is class struggle, and Marx recognizes that, obviously. But he wasn't a Luddite as such. What about Gavin Miller's Breaking Things at Work? I haven't read it. I've listened to, I think he did a podcast on Politics Theory Other, which is very interesting, and I'd encourage everyone to listen to. You know, and I share some of his, I have a real interest in his work, and I should read it more, but I'm afraid I can't go into details on this. Someone else in the audience will know more about it than I do, and we can hand over to them. I think would be a better idea.
Okay. I see no other question. Is there anybody to say something? You are all satisfied. Okay.
Owen has his hand up.
Owen?
Or maybe, yeah, I think he does.
Okay, can I speak? Yeah, there's a bit of a last minute question. I just wanted to, this doesn't really speak to your central concern about ecology and so on and climate crisis, but it's fascinating. It's been interesting me for a while, but I'm interested in what this ideas of technology fetishism might say about alienation and the relationship between technology and alienation, and particularly in the time that we live in. Is there a clear relationship between technology under capitalism and alienation? And do we see any kind of trend or trajectory in this regard? I'm just thinking of particularly the world we're living in and the way it's been accelerated in the last year or so. So we find ourselves sitting in small rooms, looking at each other through screens. And I keep thinking of E.M. Forster's short story written in 1908, I think it was, The Machine Stops. People might be familiar with that, which depicts a kind of techno dystopia in which everyone is sitting in small rooms looking at each other through screens. But anyway, I just wondered whether there's, is there a relationship that can be traced here between techno-fetishism, the critique of techno-fetishism, and the kind of critique of capitalist alienation? Did that make any sense? Was that coherent? I don't know.
Yeah, it was coherent. Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, I guess there's the sense in which technology evolves from being tools that individuals, well, humans socially in small groups usually use to transform the world around them, plows and weapons and so on. But with the advent of capitalist modernity, this process is turbocharged, and technology becomes something that is integrated into much broader environments controlled by enormous corporations. And so the alienation of the individual from the technology becomes linked to the increasing domination of capitalist organizations over the individual. And the point is being reached nowadays where technology itself comes to constitute our entire environment, you know, with the Internet of Things emerging and such like. So yeah, that's that. I think in that context, that's where we see a sort of techno-skeptical or techno-appalled reaction to the enormous scale of technologies and the tininess of the individual human being. That basic romantic reflex offers a critique of a sort of elementary critique of alienation that can be picked up by Marxism and developed as a more coherent Marxist critique of capitalist modernity. Yeah, exactly. As Owen writes in the comments in the chat, we see how the internet, you know, there were quite a few people on the left. There's such a lot of techno-utopianism on the left. I recall in the early 2000s, in people seeing the internet as, you know, a naturally democratic free space, which is going to transform all our lives for the better, echoing the corporations that were about to hijack the entire internet and convert it to their goal of making profits and dominating us in every little aspect of our lives. And this experience is why I'm pretty skeptical of techno-utopian arguments vis-a-vis climate technologies, even when they come from the left these days. Even though I recognize that, as you know, as I've been explaining, of course, that as we all realize, I'm sure that some very significant innovations are important. Jong Songjin has asked me a question as well. Can I be called a degrowth communist rather than a theorist of the Green New Deal? I suppose so, yeah. Degrowth communist, I'd happily wear that as a badge. I'm not really a degrowth, I think the degrowth movement has been very useful in putting a kind of left romantic argument, which is very salutary in this age of the worship of technology and this age in which the green movement is still dominated completely by eco-modernism. I'm reluctant to call myself a degrowther because that movement is quite centered on a utopian socialist / anarchist project that isn't really quite me, but I think what the degrowthers do realize, at least, which many people don't, many on the left included, is just the enormous scale of reduction in energy use and material throughput that is required, I believe, to effectively confront the climate emergency that we face. And there's an awful lot of eco-modernism on the left that just believes the bourgeois mantra that yeah, so long as we devise more efficient technologies, we can carry on business as usual. We can expand high-speed rail lines all over the world. We can just paper the world we can carpet the world with wind farms and solar farms and get all the energy we need and continue and rebuild all the buildings of the world as passive houses and so on. And the materials will just come from somewhere. And a lot of these people call themselves historical materialists, but they're not very materialist in that they don't look at materials in that very crude basic sense of the term. And the degrowthers, even though many of them are idealists, philosophically, they tend to have a good sense of what material use involves and how much energy it requires to lift a plane off the ground, for example. And so all these eco-modernists who talk of, carry on flying, a lot of the American left, the sort of DSA left, the Jacobin project, for example, they wouldn't dare criticize the dominance of the aviation industry because they argue, and it's a plausible argument, that that if they did so, that would make a left project unpopular. And so they say, well, this leads them to say, we'll just have biofueled aircraft. But I don't think that's really getting to grips with the materials required for lifting a plane off the ground, for example. I mean, you need to try, you can almost lift a mini car, but not plane. Jamie is adding lots of references. The Rockström piece is very good, yeah. Sorry, there's a lot happening in chat right now that I've missed. Yeah, the climate tipping points is very good. The Rahmstorff, Stefan, and so on. I don't know some of these other pieces. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I see no
Josh
other
has his hand up.
question. Okay.
Josh? Are you muted?
Oh, there we go. Now you can hear me. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. I was just wondering, Gareth, and maybe you can't answer this, but how far do you see, and this is maybe a slightly UK-centric question, but how far do you see this techno-utopianism, which we can see emerging on the left? We can look at Aaron Bastani's book on fully automated communism, and you've got Paul Mason and with this post-capitalist stuff, and then from a different perspective, you have the utopianism maybe of the degrowth movement. And how far do you see this maybe as a symptom of a lack of a coherent Marxist left to challenge some of the questions that you're speaking about, and maybe being late to the debate on climate change?
Yeah, in a sense, I can see that argument. Although I guess forms of utopianism are necessarily inscribed in the present flight, regardless of the state of the Marxist left. Bourgeois ideology has to become much more utopian than it ever was, at least in regard to technologies, because to maintain the existing system, which cannot effectively confront the emergency that we're facing, requires or necessarily creates a space for utopian dreams, which, it being bourgeois ideology, gravitate, of course, straight to technology. So there's something necessarily utopian about that. And meanwhile, on the radical fringe, excuse me, on the radical fringes on the left, for example, among the degrowthers, you have a different kind of utopianism. They are the realists who recognize the scale of the problem, but the project that they are pushing for cannot gain a mass following very easily, because it requires a revolutionary transformation of the world, which is not in the immediate grasp of ordinary people. And so it feels necessarily utopian. Does that answer your question, Josh? What's your view on it? You were shaking your head. Was that? Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself again. No, I'm still. Yeah, I'm. What you say makes a lot of sense.
Lim Sang Hun Lim had his, or Lim Sang Lim. Sorry, I'm terrible at name order. Your hand was up.
Oh, thanks. Oh, well, I'm Sang-hon. Lim is my family's name, but thank you very much for your excellent.
Sorry, Sang-hon.
Yeah, Sang-hon. And well, because I have heard about you as an expert of Karl Polanyi's work. So if it is all right to ask in this question, so technological development and innovation could mean the expansion of freedom. And I think one of the very important themes and project of Marxism is how to distribute this enlarging freedom more fairly to people. So and I guess that's also what Karl Polanyi thought about. Actually, to me, it is hardly imaginable to think what kind of Marxist theory there could be if. Thank you very much, sir. What kind of what is that? Marxist theory there could be, which presupposes the reduction of kind of the aggregate level of freedom instead of the increase of freedom. So, if my question makes any sense, so yes. Whatever the way it could be, I guess, isn't basic premise the increase of freedom, the general freedom, instead of the decrease of freedom, and the matter is how to distribute them to more fairly to the people. Thank you. Well, one thing I can say is this question is inspired by Charlie Chaplin's very famous speech in the movie The Great Dictator. And he emphasized very much that the Mother Earth is abundant and full of materials for everybody or something. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for your fusion of Charlie Marx with Charlie Chaplin. You may have noticed that I included a Charlie Chaplin slide in my presentation. I mean, I was whisking through these slides very quickly, but there was one from old Charlie in Modern Times. The man in the machine. I don't think, I mean, Polanyi was, your question didn't really relate strongly to Polanyi, but you did bring him in. I don't think Polanyi came up with a particularly powerful theory on technology, but he was part of the, you know, he comes from a romantic anti-capitalist background. Lukács was a best friend for a while when he was young. It was a romantic anti-capitalist milieu, but also quite techno-utopian. I mean, this ferment among left intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century, that kind of conjunction was fairly common, and Walter Benjamin belongs there as well. Polanyi himself was never a technophile, particularly, not in his daily life. He loved his telephone, but that was the marvelous machine for him. But beyond that, he wasn't particularly a gadget man. But along with the Frankfurt School people, some of whom he knew, he was friends with Erich Fromm. He began to develop a sort of critique of technology as alienation in the 1950s. And he was particularly influenced by Lewis Mumford. So, and Mumford is basically a sort of left liberal romantic, fascinating character, I think. On his work I drew in the talk that I gave earlier. But I'm circling around your key question, because the point you're really driving at is this: Marx as far as I understand, if I've understood you correctly, Marx's whole project is predicated on the belief that increasing mastery over the relationship with nature, as Benjamin put it, and as Marx, I think, would have put it, or did put it as well. This mastery of our relationship with nature involves an increasing ability to produce abundance and to expand our needs. We are a needs expanding species, for Karl Marx. But now we face a situation where some of those needs are going to have to be restricted. We can't all have 10 cars, or we'll destroy the planet, and that's what we're doing. So there has to be some very significant degrowth of some sort or other, and this was not part of Marx's framework. But I think we can draw on 2 points from Marx to counter that, or to argue that you can rebuild a Marxism perfectly compatible with his own views on the basis of what we now face. And one point is that Marx was this is the ecological Marx that John Bellamy Foster so brilliantly has helped us understand, and many others more recently too, Andres Malm and Jason Moore and Kohei Saito especially, and many others who are drawing on Marx to develop an ecological Marxism, and finding the ecological Marx in Marx himself. So Marx was very keenly aware that human society depends on nature. And if we destroy the planet, there's no human society. I mean, Marx realized that in a profound way, I think. Capitalism involves the destruction of the soil, the destruction of nature. And that's a key reason for why we have to abolish capitalism and replace it with a system that is friendly to human beings and caring of the planet. Secondly, another point I think we need to remind ourselves on in Marx is the point that I made with the slide on the safety pin. Marx believed enough abundance was immediately around the corner back in 1848, before the invention of lots of things that we consider absolutely part of our furniture. And so if there was sufficient abundance to provide people with all their basic needs and enable them to create a society that could flourish back in the 1850s, then I guess we can, on some questions of material throughput and commodity use, we're perfectly able to row back a bit and for this project still to be compatible with Marxism. Sorry, I didn't put that last point as fluently as I might have done, but it was a good, interesting point you raised, Sang-Hun, and I hope I've addressed it, at least in part.
Okay. One more question. Paul Zaremka, isn't Marshall Shellin's work important for you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, well, I'm not a great expert on Salins, but I've read some of his work. I mean, he was, Polanyi had a relationship to Salins as well, so I looked at him through that lens as well. Stone Age Economics, that was Salins, wasn't it? It's a very important book to help us understand the topics that we're looking at here. Yeah, and sorry, I don't have Salins particularly uploaded in my mind at the moment, even though he left us recently, didn't he? So maybe it is time to go back and read a bit of Salins.
Okay, I think now there is no need to discuss, and then it's time to close the discussion. Dr. Dale, I thank you very much for your great talk and answers and discussions. Thank you very much for all. It was a very great time to share the very important knowledge with you and discuss with you. And we will meet again in the next session. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jong Sung Jin and Go Jin Woo and Hyun Kan for organizing this and inviting me to speak to you. And thanks for all the questions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.